The Gospel of today paints the portrait of a true disciple. We are given the story of Bartimaeus, and this story of Bartimaeus is painted in a backdrop of the three predictions of the passion, death and resurrection of Jesus. Each time Jesus predicts his passion, death and resurrection, there are people who misunderstand, his own disciples who misunderstand, who are supposed to be following him and understanding him. At the first prediction, it is Peter who misunderstands. At the second prediction, we have all the disciples fighting for who's the greatest. And at the third prediction, we have James and John vying to sit at the right and the left of Jesus when he comes into his kingdom. And here we have blind Bartimaeus, a beggar who's sitting at the side of the road. And when he hears that Jesus is passing by, he shouts out. What does he shout out? He says, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Two things to keep in mind. First, he calls Jesus the Son of David. Who is the Son of David? Solomon. And why is Solomon so important? Because Solomon is the one who built the temple. And what is Jesus going to do? He is on the way to Jerusalem to replace that temple. He is to be the new temple. The second thing that Bartimaeus says is, "Have mercy on me." And this might pass us by in the English, but the word mercy in the Mediterranean context means someone who is willing to pay a personal debt. And therefore, if I were to have mercy on you, it would mean that I was willing to pay your personal debt. Bartimaeus, although physically blind, he is unable to see, has great insight. He lacks physical sight, but has divine insight into the person of Jesus. He recognizes in him the new Solomon who will build the new temple. He recognizes also in him the one who would pay his debts. Blindness was considered a sin, and a sin had to be rectified. Jesus is the one who will pay for his sins. Bartimaeus recognizes this. Bartimaeus' response, my dear brothers and sisters, characterizes the response of every true disciple. When Jesus calls him, he throws off his cloak, he jumps up and he runs to Jesus. This is exactly how every evangelist describes the call and the response of every person who follows Jesus. When his sight is restored, what does Mark tell us? He says he followed Jesus on the way. On the way where? On the way to Jerusalem. Jesus is heading to Jerusalem, and there he will undergo his passion, his death and his resurrection. While the true disciples of Jesus, whom Jesus himself chose, misunderstand the concept of discipleship, here is a blind man who knows who Jesus is, and once his sight is restored, is able to see the direction in which Jesus is headed and follows him. The story of Bartimaeus also teaches us a very important lesson. You and I often look to greater things. We often ask God for this thing or that thing, or this blessing or that blessing. But the story of Bartimaeus tells us that God meets us at the point of our weakness. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is really what being a Christian is about. As a Christian, I do not ask God for all kinds of things, but I ask God for the gift of insight, to be able to understand that in my present situation, in my present ups and downs, how is God present in my life? And knowing that, in which direction is God leading me? The letter to the Hebrews makes this amply clear. It tells us that Jesus, like a high priest, has become one of us. He understands us and he meets us at the point of our weakness. We find in the first reading a poem of Jeremiah which promises the exile's return to Jerusalem. But take a look at the reading. Who does Jeremiah call out? He says, I will lead the people from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Who are these people? The lame, the crippled, the suffering, the women with child, women in labor, all these people who society at that time considered as nobodies, as nothing, as non-persons. God identifies with them and God meets them at the point of their weakness and leads them back. In the exile, they have experienced a cross-like situation. They have met God in their weakness, away from their homeland, in their despair. And God is the one who leads them back. The readings then, my dear brothers and sisters, challenge you and me to look at our lives, to look at the ups and downs we face, and to ask God, like Bartimaeus, for the gift of sight, the gift to look at where we are and what we do, and recognize God's handiwork taking place right under our noses. That God meets us in the moment of crisis, in the moment of distress, in the moment of despair, and He leads us on. Have you been struggling with a crisis? Well, now you know what to do. Look at blind Bartimaeus. He didn't have sight, but he had insight. Pray for the grace and for the gift to recognize God in the midst of your problems.